Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience in education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Elizabeth Offord. She is Curriculum Director at Lafayette Academy in Lake St. Louis, Missouri. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Talking today about why teaching morphology is important. And before we begin, please tell us more about what you do as Curriculum Director and perhaps a little more about Lafayette Academy.
Of course. Lafayette Academy is a K-12 classical private school in Lake St. Louis. We have the great honor of being a Hillsdale program school. And as Curriculum Director, I have the opportunity to help coach our teachers in using that Hillsdale curriculum that is so wonderful. And I also have the opportunity of teaching middle school literature, which is delightful.
There are going to be people who begin listening to this program, parents perhaps, those not involved in the day-to-day operation of education, who have no idea what we're talking about. So let's start by defining our terms. What is morphology?
One of my favorite questions. Morphology is the study of word parts. And when we say word parts or morphemes, we're referring to the most basic unit of meaning in English. Most of you probably have heard the word prefixes, suffixes, base words, roots, Greek and Latin roots. These are all morphemes.
And so how does morphology now contribute to literacy?
So with Hillsdale Schools, we have the great honor of getting to teach literacy essentials for orthography, for the study of the spelling patterns and rules in English. And this is taught explicitly using literacy essentials, the journey from spelling to reading, in grades K through 3. The orthography never stops being used. That is the foundation upon which we build. However, once students arrive in 4th, 5th, 6th grade and beyond, they are now thrown into a world of academic vocabulary in their history, their science, even their literature, that they have to encode and decode using those orthography skills. But they also have to gather meaning for themselves. Mm-hmm. And as students are attempting to comprehend what they read, a big piece of comprehension, especially with unknown words, is morphology. You might not have ever heard or seen that word before, but if you know the morphemes that make up that word, then you can, without even grabbing a dictionary, at least take a stab at what it means.
When does morphology instruction begin?
Well, the thing with morphology is there are really two different types of morphemes. So we have one type of morphemes which would be very natural to us. That would be adding suffixes such as an S. And we start using these from the time we can talk. I want a cookie. I want 2 cookies. And so these inflectional morphemes, I would say, are taught with the orthography explicitly in K through 3. But we also have morphemes that change the meaning of a word, suffixes that change the part of speech and the usage of a word. And this really begins its explicit instruction in second grade, I would say primarily, and is very well integrated in level 3 of literacy essentials as well. But again, it's in fourth grade that students in their studies of science and history really begin to encounter a much higher level of words of Greek and Latin origin. And when you look at English as a whole, we have over 1 million words in English. Over 60% of those words are of Greek and Latin origin. But when you enter into academic vocabulary content studies, we see that number increase to over 90% of the words students encounter are from Greek and Latin. And so that means that that's really the time, and we have to come alongside them and be intentional. And that's where we see English from the roots up being used in our classrooms starting in level 4, grade 4, because we need to make sure that students with the great capacity and amount of words they're encountering, we're increasing the volume of morphemes we're teaching as well. So I would say starting in fourth grade really is when that instruction should increase.
Take us inside the classroom a little bit. What does the instruction then look like as students are introduced to morphology and then they get more intense in their studies? What does that look like?
So in a perfect world, morphology and orthography and etymology should all be integrated and taught in a way that you couldn't pull them apart. So when we think of a spelling lesson for any grade, for 4th grade through 12th grade, if I was going to introduce vocabulary, I would introduce it as a spelling word where we go from speech to print. So I make sure my students can encode that word. And in order to write or encode a word, you have to know the orthography. So, for example, if we were teaching the word phone, hopefully they can spell phone by 4th grade. But for the sake of this example, I think it will be easy. Mm-hmm. I would say, class, our word today is phone. Everyone say it. Phone.
Phone.
Would you like to be my student?
Of course.
Okay. What sounds do you hear in phone?
There's an F type sound.
Ooh, can I help you?
Sure.
O, N. Your turn. You try.
O, N.
Very good. So I would say, class, this word is a Greek word. So which sound are we going to use for the f sound? And at this point, from their K through 3 instruction, they should know that in Greek words, we use PH for that f sound. So I am teaching orthography. We're going to go through and I'm going to say it's a Greek word. They know what to use for f, O, and I could say it's a vowel, consonant, E syllable. Again, that's orthography. And now they can write the word. Mm-hmm. That's the orthography piece. They know it's of Greek origin, so they know which spelling pattern to use. And then we can read the word, of course. Now, let's say that this was an interesting word, and maybe it has a bit of history, an interesting story that goes alongside it. Then this is where we can see etymology also get pulled in, and we can go, ooh, in Old English it was spelled this way. For example, the word sword. If we hear the word sword, what sounds do you hear?
S or D.
Very good. You're learning.
I'm going to get this. By the time we're done, I'm going to get it.
You're a great student. So for the word sword, if they wrote what they heard, they would leave out that W, right? Mm-hmm. That you and I know is there. But I want them to write that W in order to write it correctly. So I could tell my students, class, the word is sword, but we're going to think to spell sword so they can hear it, so they can write it. And I could tell them, and I love to tell students the story of English at the beginning of the year. Mm-hmm. So we talk through what is Old English, Middle English, and Modern English, and why do we have these divides throughout English's history. And so I would tell them in Old English, the word was sword, and they all loved saying sword as they brandish imaginary swords. And then I say in Middle English, that silent, or the E sound dropped out, and it became sword. So people would have said sword. And then spelling was standardized in the 1400s. And once it was standardized, the spelling didn't change anymore. But the thing about language, all language, is that it slowly changes over time. And so as the pronunciation of sword changed over time, the w became silent. And instead of saying sword, 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 sword is what we now have in modern English. So when my students go to spell this word, they now have this history of the word, and they will remember sword, 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 but they will never forget to write that silent W.
Right.
And so as you're encountering these words in academic vocabulary, particularly where you want them to be able to spell it and read it correctly, that's the orthography. You want them to be able to understand the meaning of the individual word parts. And then that's the morphology. And then you also need to give them a framework to hold on to, well, why is it spelled that way? Or where does that word part come from? And what are the cultural implications of that word part? Did we get that during the Normandy French invasion? Or did it come to us during the Renaissance? There are implications beyond just the literal meaning of the morpheme that can help them understand the cultural history of English, which is also really important.
Talking with Elizabeth Offord, who is Curriculum Director at Lafayette Academy in Lake St. Louis, Missouri, about why teaching morphology is important. So we go through a number of lessons like that. What's the benefit? Can it help students read, help them better understand what they are reading, help them with spelling? Where are the benefits here for students?
Absolutely. So when you look at our nation's report card for reading, it is pretty clear that there is a drop-off in reading scores between about 3rd and 4th grade. And there are a number of reasons for this. A lot of them can be rooted in the lack of explicit phonics instruction. But I think another key component is the morphology, because students in upper elementary school are being given textbooks, history and science textbooks, and fairly advanced literature. And when they are encountering unknown words, and they are trying to comprehend what they read independently, they need to have the tools to not just encode and decode these words, to be able to read and spell these words, but they need to be able to gather meaning from the words, from the individual words themselves. So when you look at that decline in reading comprehension in upper elementary school, I think one really important component is the morphology. They need to have a lexicon that is intentionally built, a vocabulary that has been added to. And with over 1 million words in English, we cannot possibly teach them every word explicitly. We can't say, this is the definition, and we're going to practice using it. In fact, in order to acquire a word into your lexicon, it takes at least 12 meaningful encounters. So if you think about having 1 million words meaningfully encountered about a dozen times each, we don't have that many minutes in the day. But much like learning 72 spelling patterns enables you to encode and decode most any word in English, when you learn a collection of morphemes, then it also allows you to comprehend and add meaning to hundreds and hundreds of words you have never been explicitly taught.
You tell me if I'm way off base here. I think as you talk about diagramming a sentence, which I loved to do when I was a student, loved diagramming sentences. And by diagramming a sentence, you begin to understand what parts do in the sentence. And right, can we think about morphology in a similar way when it comes to how a word is put together?
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is, so with Greek, the morphemes act like compound words. Often. The word homophone, right? Homophone, same sound. And so they're nice and easy to identify. Those morphemes we tend to approach with no difficulty. The Latin side of English, the morphemes are often harder to identify because they are not able to be used in isolation. If you think of the word respect, spect does not stand on its own.
Right.
And so oftentimes when you're approaching affixes and roots, you have to teach your students to analyze, to look for them, and to recognize that not only are they sometimes being seen in partiality, sometimes, we will end up cutting off part of the root in order and using a connector to put together two roots. Or we will sometimes even change a prefix to make it easier. So the prefix con, like in conspicuous, we will change the n to an m, depending on the word we're adding it to. And so there are lots of examples like this where the prefix, you might teach the prefix con, but then you have to teach them that, well, in words where the root starts with an m, it's going to also change to an m, or this root, you might see it in partiality. So oftentimes I'll have the student write out the word, and I guess you could say we diagram it. We'll mark it for orthography like they have done in K3, but then we'll rewrite it without any syllable breaks, without any other orthographic markings, and we will put boxes around all of the morphemes so that they can then identify it for themselves and define it for themselves before we look to a dictionary.
Is the teaching of morphology, I don't want to say unique, but is it associated with classical education? Is that where we're going to find it most often, say, in schools?
That's a great question. You will see morphology sometimes popping up in vocabulary materials. I think that in my experience, I have not seen much. I've seen vocabulary taught in a variety of schools, including public schools. I think what's really unique, though, in what Hillsdale has set up its instruction to do is that it is making an attempt to integrate the content areas. And to me, that is specifically classical. The way you teach morphology is classical. So, for example, taking the orthography, morphology, and etymology and combining those into one lesson with the intent to teach beautiful vocabulary, the result is that students love words and they become obsessed with collecting them. You read out loud to them from beautiful literature and they go, oh, wait a minute. That word, it sounds like I hear that root inside of it that we learned the other week. Is that root? Is that word? Oh, it's not that root. It was similar. Can we add it to our wall? And we have a wall where we collect words that are just interesting and they're beautiful. And my students want to look them up to see when we're done with the lesson, can we look them up in the Oxford English Dictionary, which has beautiful histories of all the English words you could think of. If you don't have a subscription, you should. But they collect these words, and the result is they use these words when you give them opportunity, intentional opportunity. And as they learn to add these words into their lexicon, it enables them, it empowers them to communicate ideas, to develop their rhetoric. And to me, everything about that is what classical education does. And so it's not just teaching them words, it's really teaching them how to think and to love what is good, true, and beautiful.
So you were talking a bit about this there. You love words and you want your students to love words. So how does that happen? How can teachers help their students become interested and passionate about words?
I think Dorothy Kardatsky said this once, and I have never forgotten it. She said, enthusiasm is caught, not taught. And for me, I have learned to love words for myself by simply looking up the etymology of words, by taking the time to go, why is that spelled that way? Why does rhythm have RH in it and a Y and a TH and an M? I'm not really sure. What does that word mean? What exactly does that mean? What is the origin of that word? When I am reading and I start to just ask those questions for myself and then find the answers, I learned to bring that process into my classroom and do it in front of my students. So if we were reading a book, and I've taught 2nd grade, 4th grade, kindergarten, and 7th and 8th grade. With all of those grade levels, if I am reading aloud to them or we're reciting a poem and I hear a word that I just think is beautiful or interesting, or I have no idea what it means, I will stop and say, whoa, and repeat the word and say it again. And they will just say it with me out of curiosity. And as we sit there saying the word, then I'll go, I wonder what that means. You know what? I've never heard it used in this context. Let's write it on the board. And after we finish this chapter, let's look it up. And then I will. I make sure that every single time we do that, I do go and I look it up in front of them. I share with them the history and I go, ooh, that entered during Middle English and we borrowed it from the French and they used it to mean this, but now we use it with this context in mind. And then I'll reread the sentence or the part of the poem it was used in so that together we can just appreciate it. And the more I have done that in every single one of those grade levels, then my students begin to do that and ask me, Miss Offord, please, can we please look up that word? Could you look up this word? I found this word while reading by myself. Could we look it up? And so it builds the enthusiasm because it's a pursuit of all. It's a communal pursuit.
Yes. Elizabeth Offord is Curriculum Director at Lafayette Academy in Lake St. Louis, Missouri, as we talk about why teaching morphology is important. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us here on the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast.
Thank you. It was so much fun. It's one of my favorite topics.
I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K-12. That's Hillsdale_K-12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio.